started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the final of our 9-part series on emergency planning. And the session today is going to focus on planning for nursing home evacuation. So I'm so glad you could all join us. My name is Christy Fable, and I'm a Quality Improvement Advisor with Superior Health Quality Alliance. And I'll be facilitating today's call. Along with several other Superior Health colleagues that are here today. We've got Tony Kettner, Allie Albers, Mike Bittner, Katie Pashota, and Penny Clary. So we're just so happy you could join us. Before I introduce our speakers for today's call, I want to take this time to review a few housekeeping items. First of all, we're going to post the slide deck several times into the chat box for your convenience. Please feel free to add questions and comments into the chat box as you think of them, and we'll answer the questions at the end of the call. There'll also be an opportunity to ask a live question at the end of the call, and we will review the process on how to do that a bit later. This series is being recorded and will be available on the Stratus Health YouTube channel in about 2 weeks. This will allow you and your team to access the recordings on demand when it's convenient for you. We will also post an evaluation link at the end of today's call, and we would really appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to complete it for us. We use the evaluations to improve calls and to determine if there are other topics that you might find helpful. So at this time, I would like to introduce our speakers, Brian Kaczmarski and Amy Wolomneseth. Brian and Amy.
Thank you very much, Christy. So today, it's hard to believe this is our last of our 9-part series, but we are very grateful for those of you who have stayed with us and have taken the time to look at these videos after the fact. Today, we're going to be focusing on evacuation and what really is often referred to as a very last resort. So we're going to think a little bit about what would be the potential scenarios or triggers that would cause an evacuation. And it may not be a full evacuation, but a partial evacuation as well. And we're going to give some examples of 2 facilities, one that did well and one that didn't do so well, and talk about the difference between those 2 experiences. And the real key difference in that was pre-planning, which we will be discussing in more detail. We're going to talk about maintaining those pre-incident levels of care through evacuation. CMS now says that if you are evacuating your facility, you still have to be able to maintain the same level of care for your residents and your patients. That's tricky. And so we need to be thinking about what would that involve in order to care appropriately for our patients. We also can't do evacuation alone. So we need to think about, well, who would our partners be? How many partners would we need for things like transportation, alternate care site, etc. And then think about where can we practice these concepts? How do we engage with training and exercising so that when the bad day comes, we're ready to go? So if you think about your role as a healthcare provider, what is your primary purpose and goal? And of course, that's to provide safe and appropriate quality care to those that we serve. And so if evacuation truly is the last resort, we know that when you put the work into the planning and the conversations with community partners, that evacuation can go well. And when it does, it's the best of times, right? But we also know, and we have plenty of examples of when evacuation did not go well. And when it goes badly, it goes very badly. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how do we continue to provide that safe, appropriate, quality care, even when we have to evacuate. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. The first one is St. Rita's Nursing Home, which was in St. Bernard Parish in New Orleans. This is a picture from 2005 during Hurricane Katrina. And I think many of you have seen these pictures. At the time, they were all over the internet. And Brian is going to talk a little bit about another example, and we'll show you some unique things about that picture. But we know that Hurricane Katrina was devastating, and St. Rita's nursing home was one of the casualties of that hurricane. There's a link to this news article that I would really encourage you to read. What happened is when the hurricane came, the state issued evacuation orders, but they left the ultimate decision whether or not to leave the building up to the local authorities. And St. Bernard's Parish never ordered a mandatory evacuation. So the owners of that nursing home, having owned that facility for many, many years, decided that they were going to shelter in place because they had done so successfully for 20 years. But as we all know, levees broke, and this was a Category 5 storm. And so when the owners chose not to evacuate, the ultimate result was that 35 residents died due to the flooding in that facility. What happened later is that the owners were charged with negligent homicide. And this went on in the court system for quite a while. And eventually they were acquitted because the jury decided that because they were not under mandatory evacuations, basically they did the best that they could. This quote from one of the daughters of one of the residents is just really profound. You know, she was there trying to stay with her mother, trying to calm her down during the storm, when all of a sudden she's watching the bed rising in the floodwaters, and she's trying to hang on to her mother when somebody finally says, "There's a boat here, let's try to go." And so that was basically how she and her mother survived that experience. But just imagine now, granted, we don't live in the upper Midwest in hurricane country, right? But this next example is going to give you a more realistic example of what we may face in our communities. So this was Columbus Regional Hospital in 2008. This was where a levee broke, again, a dam, and many of us live downriver of dams in our communities. They were successful in evacuating 157 patients within 3 hours. Now, again, this is a hospital scenario, but it can apply. The lessons learned can certainly apply to a long-term care or a skilled community, skilled nursing community. By the time this storm was over, or it wasn't even a storm, by the time the water that came from the dam, then the levee that broke, there were 8 inches of water in the main floor. And so everything that was on the basement level, all of the equipment, all of the offices, all of the furniture, all the computers, everything that was down in the basement had to be destroyed. And so they suffered $180 million worth of damage. Again, I really encourage you to watch. It's about a 9-minute video on this situation on YouTube. It's a fabulous example of not only the decision-making process of whether or not to evacuate, but then all of the silver linings, so to speak, that came out of this experience in what was really a very successful evacuation of a very large hospital. So I'd encourage you to take the time. It's well worth your time to view that. So what made the difference between these two tales, right? One that had plenty of warning. They knew the hurricane was coming. They did the best that they could given the information they had. But because the storm was different, because the storm was much more powerful and the levees broke when they didn't expect them to, they weren't ready for an evacuation. We can question that judgment all we want, but the point is that the plans were not there. Whereas the other facility, because of Hurricane Katrina, and he actually cites Hurricane Katrina as one of the reasons why he took action sooner than later, is that plan, the triggers, when do we evacuate, and then how do we evacuate safely and efficiently so that our patients can be cared for. So where do we begin? And in some ways, this goes all the way back to the very first webinar that we did when we were talking about creating that culture of preparedness. It involves all of the aspects of your emergency operation plan, which you are required to have for the CMS emergency preparedness ruling. Remember what those 4 key elements are. First of all, risk assessment. If you live downriver of a dam, it's a good thing to know that. And it's a very good thing to know that to have those plans that if and when something like that were to happen, you are ready to go. What are your hazards? Have you built within a floodplain? Are you within the 500-year floodplain, 1,000-year floodplain? And again, think about the fact that climate is changing. And so what we think of sometimes as the 500-year flood might actually be much more common than our original planning. Think about your communication plans. Again, how do you communicate to your staff as well as to your community partners that you need help to evacuate your building? Policies and procedures, again, focusing on the functions. There is the shelter-in-place decision versus the evacuation decision. And one of the key aspects of those policies should be those triggers. The last is training and exercising, and that ongoing need for initial training for your staff as they come onto your facility and onto your payroll, but then the ongoing training that we need to continue to provide and practice so that we're ready when the day comes. Again, just a review of what we had talked about before. The risk assessment, the tool that many of us use is the Kaiser Permanente tool. This is all about ranking your risks, your hazards, be they natural, human-made, or technological. And again, this is a requirement that it is done annually, and it is a requirement that you review it annually. And so I don't know how many of you have dam failure in your plan. It may be major flooding, but it is something that you certainly need to consider within your risk assessment. The next question, once you've done that risk assessment, is who do I serve? Who are my patients? What are the things that you have to consider as a unique organization because of the population and the patient type that you care for? So for example, if you have a memory care wing, if you evacuate, those patients are going to have unique needs. You can't just give them directions of where to go safely. You're most likely going to have to provide staff, or you're going to have to provide some mechanism to make sure that you don't lose patients as you're leaving the building, right? If there are people that are bedbound or in frail health for any other reason, that is something that you also need to consider. Think about the bariatric patients, the patients that may have behaviors that we need to be aware of. Obviously, if you serve incarcerated, which many of you do not, but think about our jails. They have to have a plan to evacuate and to secure the safety, not only of the prisoners, the staff, but the community. Those of you who do have vented patients, that's a very unique kind of patient type that, again, we need to plan for if we're taking them off of their regular ventilators. How do we have enough staff to make sure we're bagging them appropriately and that they have an appropriate location to go to that can provide that same level of care? And then again, anybody that provides emergency care, how do you decide to turn off or shut down your emergency department when you're in the midst of evacuation? And when you watch that video from Colombia, one of the first priorities that they had was to reopen their emergency department, because that was one of their essential services. They were a key partner within their community to provide those kinds of services. So think through that. Who do you serve? How many people do you serve? How many of them are ambulatory? How many of them can be wheelchair bound? How many of them can only be evacuated by a bed? That will have a lot to do with what kind of planning you do for an evacuation. Now, there's basically 2 types of evacuation. There's the advanced warning, and then there's the no notice. So some examples of the advanced warning, again, of course, hurricanes, when we know that we have a projection of a storm that's going to be coming for 3 to 4 days, people have the time and the opportunity to track that through the National Weather Service and then to make the appropriate plans. We also have the luxury usually of a blizzard or a major winter storm, something with high winds. We usually have some warning for those kinds of things. And a wildfire, again, those who live in California or in Canada right now, they're watching the news, right? They know at least what the projections are for that wildfire, knowing that there's always the possibility of the wind shifting or things changing. But usually that is something that is an advanced warning decision. No notice, however, obviously, is if you have a fire within your facility, you have to get people moved immediately. Same thing with tornadoes. We usually know when there's a possibility of tornadoes, but when the actual tornado is on the ground, that is a no notice event. Or if there's a tornado and then your building suffers structural damage and you have to evacuate, that tends to be no notice. Obviously, flash flooding, anything that would damage the infrastructure of your building would require you to evacuate. So let's think about the advanced warning decision tree. So obviously we need to understand the scope of the impending event. And we need to be thinking about what kind of assessment do we need to do. If we think that we may be in the middle of a blizzard in 2 days, what do we have to think about in order to prepare for that emergency? Oftentimes we are stuck in this triangle here where we wait and we reassess. And maybe that's every 6 hours, maybe that's every 12 hours. It depends on what happens, the extent of the event, the duration of the event, all of that, as well as, I lost my thought. Anyway, or do you go ahead and evacuate? Do you make that decision that it's time to go because we've met our triggers? If that's the case, then you start that evacuation. You determine a pre-planned, hopefully, sequence of patient evacuation, and then you do it. If you decide to wait, then you shelter in place, and then the event occurs. And then hopefully you are always reassessing as to whether or not we need to go. Again, whether that's every 5 hours, every 2 hours, just depends on the incident. The most important thing, though, of course, is thinking about what are your essential services. So what do you need to do? If the mission is to continue to provide the same level of quality care that you provide your patients pre-evacuation, what do you have to think about in terms of your alternate care facility or where you need to take your patients? What do you need in order to continue to do that? Do you need laboratory? Do you need pharmacy? Do you need access to your patients' charts? Do you have to be able to feed them if you're going to be gone for 12, 24, 48 hours? What kind of systems need to be in place in order to get your infrastructure back up and running? Water, electricity, all of those things that often are part of the ingredients to continue to provide that safe and quality care. And so being able to do some pre-planning around all of those essential services is obviously very important. Last week we talked about, or a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Nursing Home Incident Command System, and there's a guidebook that is available to you. It's free to download and to peruse. One of the things that they have is what's called an incident response guide. And this is an incident response guide specifically for evacuation. Now, you can copy and paste these and put them in your policy, but one of the surveyors may come to you and say, I see that you have an incident response guide for evacuation, but show me or demonstrate to me how you have localized this plan. How have you incorporated the concepts into your facility, into your region, into your community? So it's a great place to start, but make sure you are localizing these guides to meet your needs. But again, basically, this is just a checklist. It gives you ideas of what you need to do, how you need to respond, and And this continues, it's much longer than just this one page. So again, if you're looking for how to write a plan for evacuation, this is a great tool to get you started. The other thing that I talked about was being aware of the pre-incident planning and checklist for your essential services. This is something that comes from a hospital evacuation decision guide, but again, I think it's very pertinent and relevant to any other facility. And this gives several other examples. So for example, city water. If you are dependent on city water for your organization, then you may be more vulnerable if the city water is either contaminated or unavailable, right? Is your water used for cooling? Does your hospital, does your facility have a well? If you have a well, you may have different kinds of vulnerabilities. And so this just gives you a way, again, to think through what kinds of things would impact your essential service, things that would be related to water. And so again, the entire guide is here, and I would encourage you to think through that or work through that at one of your emergency preparedness planning meetings or an exercise or a staff meeting. This is an example of what it does for electricity. Again, do you have a generator? All of you are required to have generators if you are under the CMS emergency preparedness ruling. Do you have fuel stored on site? Do you have fuel underground? Do you have an MOU with a fuel company? Those are all the kinds of things that should be addressed when it comes to electricity. And then this guide also includes sections on security, information technology, life support, natural gas, and boilers. So it's a great tool, again, questions to guide you through and think through the planning elements pre-incident for evacuation. Now, if there's a no notice event, obviously event is going to occur. We're always going to assess, right? We're always going to triage. We're always going to decide what it is that we need to do. And there's basically three choices. There's either no threat to the patient or staff, and so you stay put. Or there's an immediate threat, which means that you order an immediate evacuation. Or maybe it hasn't triggered evacuation yet, so you're going to shelter in place and wait and watch. And part of that is constantly reassessing and then eventually deciding if you need to evacuate. If you do, you start the evacuation, same thing, you determine the sequence, which hopefully you've already done, and then you carry out the evacuation. So again, there's three main decisions. If there's no threat, your patients and your staff are safe, there's no structural damage, you can stay put, but what might you also have to think about? How do you communicate that to your families, and how do you communicate that to your loved ones? Because they're going to be worried. And if you don't think your phone's going to ring off the hook, think again. If there's an immediate threat, obviously, if it's like threatening, you evacuate. And if it's an evolving threat, you wait and you constantly reassess. So the post-incident assessment, if there's no threat, basically that's what we call shelter in place. If there is a threat, you also have some other options. You can do what's called a relocation, either horizontally or vertically. So for example, if it's a flood situation, maybe you are going to move all your residents to the second floor if you have that option, unless you've got major mechanical issues that are going to be impacted in the basement. Or if you have a fire in one wing, is it possible to vertically or to horizontally evacuate to another wing behind fire doors that would keep your patients and your staff safe? Or you evacuate, again, either partially or completely. Now I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Amy. Sticking with the concept of trigger points, there's some other factors, there's multiple variables that lead to having to make a decision to shelter in place or relocate. One of the things that Amy and I always stress is if you're in that incident command mode, whether it be the nursing home incident command system or any other form of incident command, making decisions collaboratively as opposed to independent decisions is always a good idea. And that's why it's good to have those relationships with emergency response partners within your jurisdiction. But again, a few other things that you can see on the screen here, some of the other event characteristics. Again, when is it set to arrive? Is it set to arrive when you are at full staff? Is it set to arrive during night shift? That's going to factor into some of your decisions and trigger points. What is the expected magnitude? How big is the event expected to be? What is the quote path, the area of impact? That is going to, when you think about it, if you have pre-identified facilities or sister facilities or facilities that are within close proximity to you that you may have agreements with in place to either evacuate to or receive patients from, again, the larger the area that's impacted is going to force you to reach out further to facilities that would be able to meet your needs in the event that you needed to evacuate. And then again, duration. One of the things that we're finding more and more, very common threats today that are kind of creeping their way up in the HVAs is cyber attacks and or IT failures. And it's becoming harder and harder for responders to be able to provide accurate data on how long the system is going to be down. The more skilled the malware is or the bad player is in that type of scenario can impact how long your infrastructure, your electronic health records, everything that you do that's web-based for your residents and your patients. Again, if you don't know the answer to when that will be back up, that's going to impact your decisions. And then again, as Amy mentioned, some of those infrastructure things that we just can't get away from. We simply cannot function if we don't have some of these important infrastructure things. And you can see what we've identified: water, heat, electricity, and then the safety of the structure itself. Those are sort of automatics that if one or more of those is in question, that's nudging you towards that evacuation decision. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then again, effect on the community and surrounding resources. We have experienced in Wisconsin, we've experienced some major flooding, both in the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state, to the point that roads are wiped out. How do you get people out of these facilities that now all of a sudden become geographically isolated? Do you need to call in air support? Well, that's happened. And that should be part of, again, those worst case scenarios in your plans. Would we need to air evacuate because we simply can't get ground transportation to the facility? You can see security, evacuation status in nearby facilities. That's why we call it situational awareness within the incident command system. Some people may think, well, I'm more concerned about what's happening within my four walls. And that's important. You need to. Your number one priority is your staff and your residents. But if you don't have the situational awareness of what's happening around you, you may have a false sense of security that, oh, we'll be able to get out this road, or we'll be able to go to our predetermined evacuation location if you don't know the status of that location. Amy mentioned again the state or local evacuation order. Think about the government type of your state. Again, I know that we have people that are represented from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Are you a centralized government? Are you a decentralized government? That will impact who and when makes those decisions. So again, be thinking about that in terms of your response. And again, if that mandatory evacuation order comes in place, you still have the ability, I wouldn't recommend this, but you do have the ability to not listen to those orders. You're going to be exposing yourself to liability. But what I'm trying to say is you still have decision-making authority over your building. Clearly, in a coordinated decision, you're going to want to go along with governmental decisions because it provides that extra layer of liability. But do understand when that decision is not made, so there is no mandatory evacuation order, I would still be reaching out to my jurisdictional partners to say, hey, this is what we're thinking here. What do you guys think? And again, it becomes that collaborative or unified decision instead of making a decision in a silo. And then again, how many people are impacted? Are the emergency resources being spread so thin because of the event that you're simply not going to get the help that your plan assumes you're going to get? And then again, you need to work towards alternatives at that point. All of those things factor into the many variables of do we stay or do we go? Bonus points if you can name the band that created that song. So ultimately, it boils down to your trigger points. So who gets to decide? Your internal incident commander. Again, redundancy and depth into who is authorized to make those decisions. It always seems to work out that the primary incident commander, for whatever reason, is not around when the really important decision needs to be made. So you need to have those very clear lines of delegation of authority, because you may simply not have the time to wait to get a hold of that primary incident commander. Local authorities, I would be making collaborative decisions with local authorities. Unless it's an automatic, immediate threat to life and safety, I would be making collaborative, coordinated decisions with my jurisdictional leaders. System administrators, again, if you are part of a larger system or network, you're going to want to be plugged in to that higher level of command and administration that would be activated during that response. And then ultimately, how do you all work together? In the documentation, we always talk about, the appropriate ICS forms and documentation of significant events and what you did in the response. It always looks better when it's being, quote, audited after the event, that the people that are looking at your response see collaborative decision versus independent decision. That just provides that layer of safety and a little bit of extra liability, because you're showing that you reached out and you made those collaborative decisions instead of just going on your own. Next slide. For the receiving facility, again, when Amy and I first started out and the CMS rule first became implemented, I think that was in 2017, most of the plans that we saw from nursing homes, their plan was they were going to evacuate to the hospital. And the hospitals went, no, because the disaster is already likely going to have us at surge capacity. And if you have 3 or 4 nursing home facilities or assisted living facilities that are all planning to evacuate to one hospital, you've got a problem. You have made an inaccurate assumption. Safety is number one, and continuity of care falls immediately after that. So again, be thinking about, I would activate that safety officer very early in the response. And remember, their job is to watch the process of evacuation and make sure that number one, residents, and number two, staff are safe at all times. They have the authority to alter or stop operations if they see something that they deem might be unsafe. And again, those MOUs, like facilities, that's who I would be reaching out to. Again, if you're part of a network, you have a bit of an advantage because you have sort of a built-in ability to use each other's facilities, but I would be looking at, those standalone centers too. One of the things that we learned from COVID is that we lost a lot of staffing during COVID. That however, was a bit of a silver lining in that you may have a wing of the hospital that was decertified during the pandemic. Might that be an opportunity to be an evacuation site in the future? Or other nursing homes, again, that were decertifying or delicensing beds that have availability, could those turn into evacuation sites in a worst case scenario? Would you send your staff? I hope the answer is yes. That usually is the expectation in an evacuation situation, is you send the staff and stuff necessary to, again, maintain that continuity, that same level of care. Medical records, this is always a big one. You've got to have a couple of things in place for making sure that the medical records go with your residents and your patients. If you still have access to electronic health records, you have an advantage at that point, and you can simply use that process. But if you have to go the old-fashioned route and go paper medical records, have a plan to be able to do that. And how are you going to have the patients hold on to their file? Are you going to have something that is waterproof that you can put those patient records in, knowing that it could get damaged during the transport because of heavy rain or the flood or whatever happens? And then the last one is a really tricky one. And if anybody has thought through this one, and you would like to venture out an answer, but what would you do if somebody refused to evacuate? And that's a question that Amy has posed to many agencies, and we get a lot of silent responses and blank stares. So Amy, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that one, but feel free if you would like to at this time.
Yeah, the reason that I added that was because the latest version of Appendix Z, the one that came out in March of 21, one of the recommendations when you're looking at Appendix Z, you can actually search for surveyor tips or surveyor tools. And one of the questions after this page 48 is, what do you do if someone refuses to evacuate? So surveyors have been given that information as a possible question to ask you. So again, if I'm preparing for a CMS survey, I am going to make sure I have some kind of answer to this question, because it's clearly stated in Appendix Z. And I don't know that there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. I would certainly know who I would call, who's your phone a friend, to get some information, whether that's a local authority or the local law enforcement. I mean, I don't know. I think it's a very good question to ask. And it very much depends on who the patient is, right? And what the circumstances are.
Thanks, Amy, for adding that. And even in a situation like that, if you have somebody that does refuse to evacuate, I think the family is definitely going to want to be a part of that decision as well. So again, something to consider adding to your plan. Next slide, please. So let's make an assumption here that an evacuation is ordered. Some of the things, the checklist, the down and dirty that you want to be thinking about, I'm not going to go through them all here, but you can see how a lot of these very key tactics point back to the big four that we started at the very beginning of our series: your comms plan, your security plans, your staging and transport, where are you going to put people, your tracking. You need to show that you know where your patients and staff are at all times throughout the process. The triage for transport, who's going to decide that? Who decides who goes first? And there's two parts to that. Who leaves your building to get to the staging area first? And then once they're at the staging area, who goes first from the staging area to the receiving facility? Again, the medical records, how are you going to do that? Visitor and staff accountability, because again, if the bad thing happens, big bad thing happens, and you have people visiting, you're responsible for the people that are in your building. So keep that in mind as well. What is the sequence of evacuation? And we'll show a little tool on one of the upcoming slides on that. And then how are you going to ensure that you've cleared the units? Who's going to do the final walkthrough to make sure that you've gotten everybody and everything? And then are there steps to shutting down your facility, before everybody leaves? There may be things that you need to do that will protect your infrastructure once you have all left the building. And your facilities people would probably have the best knowledge of that. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about medical records and pink vests, and then I'm going to let Amy talk a little bit about the picture, because that is a very powerful picture that you're seeing on the screen right now. But one of the ideas for ensuring the safety of paper medical records and that they go with the appropriate resident is that you actually put these pink vests on your residents. And there is a waterproof pouch right on the front of the pink vest, which is an ideal place to put paper medical records. And Amy, go ahead and talk a little bit about the picture.
So this picture again is from Hurricane Katrina. I'm not exactly sure which facility, but this is the facility that went viral on Twitter when I believe it was either the staff or family members posted it saying that this nursing home needed immediate help with evacuation. Everybody has a pretty visceral reaction to nursing home residents in waist deep water, correct? But I want to point out that they have their pink vests. Do you see them? They're in the picture. Some of them actually have them on. This was something that they had put together in their nursing home. They had plans. They had a way to do this. It's just that the flooding came so quickly, they didn't have the opportunity to get them fully on. But I want to just demonstrate that they had a plan. It just, the no notice nature of it meant that they were not able to evacuate quickly. The long story short, though, is that all of the residents in this picture survived. And actually there is a follow-up picture of them once they were evacuated. And because of that Twitter post, authorities did get to them very, very quickly. So that's the gist of that.
Thanks for adding that, Amy. Next slide. So this is that little tool that we talked about, the evacuation sequence. And what I want to point out is it talks about two processes. If you look at, you can see the triage level, obviously red, yellow, and green. But the next column over is talking about priority for evacuation from the facility to the staging area. Okay, so in that particular scenario, the red patients actually go last. That's the recommendation because of the reasons that you can see in the bullet points. Yellow patients, they would go second, and you can see that your green patients would go first. If you think about ethical decisions in healthcare, this lends itself to that concept. However, now the next column over, you're looking at transfer from the staging to another healthcare facility. So again, this is the traditional start priority. So now your red patients would go first, then your yellow, and then your green. So again, depending on the process that you're talking about, will determine which triage level that you focus on first. And again, this would be something that I would definitely consider localizing and adopting into my evacuation plans. Next slide. There's a ICS form for every possible function in emergency response, and the nursing home ICS is no different. So the nursing home incident command form 255 is a patient evacuation tracking tool. It's old-fashioned pen and paper, unless you happen to have it on a laptop, in which case you could use that. This has been used. It's a good, I would say, backup tool for tracking residents in an evacuation. More primary tools, more modern tools today are wristbands with scanners, utilizing technology to the extent possible. But again, the emergency may render those tools useless during a response. So it's always good to have that backup. This is just a blow up of that particular form. But again, you can see the different things that it is asking you to document and things that should be considered to be documented during the response. Next slide. So again, this tracking form, again, a little bit blow up another part of the form. It kind of talks about the belongings, the valuables, the medications. It really walks the staff through the process of these are the things that we should be thinking of as we care for and prep each of our residents and patients to get ready for evacuation. So it's not just the down and dirty of we need to get them out of there for medical reasons and safety reasons. It talks about some of their own personal belongings as well, and ensuring that you have, if time, the ability to take those things with you. Next slide. Amy, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about this one because I think you describe it better than me, but this slide is really referring to planning for the type of transport that you're going to need based on your patient population. So Amy, do you want to chat with that one?
Yeah, again, this is somewhat based on hospital evacuation, but again, I think it's valuable. So ALS here is Advanced Life Support EMS, Basic Life Support EMS, people that can be transferred by wheelchair or bus, and the types of vehicles that would be needed in order to transport a wheelchair. So one of the first things that many people think about is, well, let's just get the school buses. Well, that works great for someone who can do steps, like elementary age kids, they can do it. But if you think about, again, your patient population, how many of your patients can do steps that would get them up into a school bus? And you may be surprised that it's many fewer than you would assume, right? So in a critical care situation, you're going to want that advanced life support. That's going to be your paramedic crew. It's going to be anybody that's on a ventilator. It's going to be your life link helicopters, your North, your Mayos, whoever your air medical transport is. Those people are going to go by ALS. In a step down unit, so that would be a unit where you've got some people that still need that critical care, some need that just that basic life support, that ambulance. Some people really could go in an Abbey van or whatever kind of wheelchair transport you may have. It may be your facility's van. And then again, there will be some people who didn't just have knee replacements or hip replacements and can actually get up into a school bus. The medical surge is most likely what your patient population would be looking like. So you're going to have a few people that are bedbound that really can't even sit up. They don't have the strength to sit up in a wheelchair or on a gurney for a BLS transport. They may have IVs running. They may have other kinds of needs, whether it's behaviors or memory or whatever it may be, physical ailments that do not allow them to be considered for that bus or that wheelchair transport. So when you think about that, it really becomes, 20, I can't do my math, but, this is something to be thinking about. It should be part of your planning as you're thinking about what kinds of resources you're going to need to reach out to. And then Brian will always make the point that when we think about wheelchair, what other kinds of facilities or organizations do we have in our community that can do wheelchair transport? So think about the school systems. They always have the ability to transport wheelchair students. So could those be utilized in an evacuation of a nursing home? This is an opportunity to be thinking outside the box. If you have to do bus transport, we actually had a situation in our region where we had mega movers and firefighters. So they opened up the back evacuation hatch door of the bus and they literally lifted patients that were in wheelchairs and lifted them into the back of the bus into the bus seat. And they had to be able to maintain their balance and sit in a bus seat. But then when they got to the alternate care facility, those local firefighters were ready with their mega movers and they just moved them off the bus the same way that they got them on. So there are ways to do it, but you have to think about it and you have to think, do we have the equipment that we need in order to do that?
And again, as Amy mentioned, trying to have at least those handshake agreements in place prior to the event with the different types of transportation entities that you have. One of the things that I would always recommend is when you think about the need for transport, transport is a resource. It's an asset that you're going to need if you make an evacuation decision. The resource key in your jurisdiction is your emergency management director. Yes, you're going to have an internal emergency management specialist. You may have some facility-owned transportation. It's likely not going to be enough, but I would be reaching out to my local jurisdiction, and that emergency management director, their jurisdiction is required to have some of these agreements in place that you see on the screen right now. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. If you can tap into some of those pre-existing agreements, absolutely, I would encourage you to do that. But again, it's about building those partnerships in advance, not reaching out on the day of the disaster saying, oh, hey, we haven't met, but I need 5 ALS ambulances in 30 minutes. You're going to have a much better chance of getting success if you have those relationships established in advance. Next slide. And again, why train and exercise? You can see the tale of two facilities that we tried to paint during this session. The one facility that was very successful because there was that pre-planning and emphasis on training and exercising, and the other facility that, well, yes, it was a once in a lifetime type of event, but again, those plans were not in place. The response could have been better than it ended up being. So why do we do that? Really, the biggest thing Amy and I always talk about when we do exercises is we want to see you fail. We want to see you fail during the exercise, because if you fail during the exercise, it's a low stress, no fault, no harm environment. And if we can fix those failures sitting around a table, you are that much more likely to be successful when the real event happens. So don't set yourselves up to always test the things that you know you're good at. Set yourself up in exercise to fail. And those are opportunities for improvement and corrective actions that you can easily identify. And you're just enhancing your overall readiness and response for whatever that big bad thing might be. Next slide. So again, here's some exercises and resources that you could potentially use, virtual exercises that I think some of our superior folks will be talking about. Having just a basic awareness of your county emergency operations plans or emergency response plans, and understanding what their functions are during an incident is going to make it easier to be able to understand how to activate some of those jurisdictional resources, even though you may be a private facility or a facility that isn't jurisdictionally owned, you can still coordinate and tap into some of those resources. And then all of the links that have been identified there all help with, again, overall emergency response planning for the type of provider that you folks are. And with that, I think we will turn it back over to our Superior Health folks for some of their comments.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. So I don't see any questions in chat, but if you would like to ask any, please put them in chat or take yourself off mute and ask a question. If you're on the phone, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6. And while we wait for those questions, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this slide here. For nursing homes, I just want you to remind you that we are reviewing emergency preparedness plans. And if you would complete the, when you get these slides, if you click on the link, you will come to a short nursing home form to fill out, and you will be able to answer those questions, and we will be able to review your emergency preparedness plan. If you're a community health partner, although I don't think that's who is in the audience today, there's also a question form for you to fill out. It looks like we just in chat here, there was the event evaluation, and just a reminder, if you could please fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. The other thing I would like to remind you about is our next, this is the last webinar in this 9-part series, and we thank you all for participating in it. We do have another one coming up though. We have a 4-part series that's starting in August. And this series is an introduction to emergency preparedness exercise, design, and evaluation. So this particular series is intended to give the audience an understanding of key definitions and the steps that are needed to create, conduct, and evaluate an exercise that will meet the exercise requirements for the CMS regulated organizations. So we would encourage you to join us for that 4-part series.
Christy, this is Tony. I just posted the link for that.
Yes, I was just going to say, you will see the series link in chat. So please register for that. And Amy, again, it will be Amy and Brian who will be leading that series. So we're very excited about that.
And then,
So yes, go ahead, Tony.
Oh, I was just going to say, and then be on the lookout next week. I believe it's the 19th. We're also going to be sending out some additional information and an opportunity to register for one of our many tabletop exercises that will be hosted by Amy and Brian. So we're really excited about that. So again, just want to alert you for the fact that that should be coming out next week so that you'll be able to register.
Thank you, Tony. And I just want to say this is kind of our last call for questions. So if you have anything that you're really like itching to ask Amy and Brian, anything related, doesn't have to be on this topic, anything related to emergency preparedness, this is kind of your chance. So I'm not hearing any. So I think maybe we will. Brian, did you want to say something?
No, what I was going to say is, I don't know if saying that we're going to be presenting the next to the series and the exercises, I don't know if that will enhance registration or detract from registration, but I guess we'll find out.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Brian and Amy, for this entire series. It's really been valuable. We appreciate it. Just a reminder that all of these are recorded and on YouTube. So if you need to review them, please do that. Or if you missed 1 or 2 of them and you want to catch up, we've got the whole series there for you. So thanks again, Brian and Amy, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity.